I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Taxation, annual rates for 2016-17, closely held companies and remedial matters bill, interrupted debate on first reading.
And when this debate was last before the House, Grant Robertson was speaking, and he has 9 minutes 20 seconds remaining.
Wow.
If he wishes to take it.
I do, Mr. Speaker.
Grant
Thank you.
Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I was rudely interrupted last night, we were discussing what had been the best thing to come out of Hamilton and never go back, and the people of Hamilton had voted strongly on that. No, it wasn't Mr. McIndoe, that's true. Mr. Bennett was the export that Hamilton didn't want back, unfortunately I can't go on any more about that for reasons I'm not allowed to refer to, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, what I'm here today to discuss is the taxation annual rates for 2016-17, closely held companies and remedial matters bill. And again, Mr. Speaker, we have in front of us a taxation bill that is ad hoc at best. I long for the day that a taxation bill would come to this House that gave us an idea of the overall goals that the government had for the tax system, what they were trying to achieve, the balance that they wanted between taxing wealth, taxing income, where they saw the future of taxation, planning for that. But no. Every single time it's a bill that's ad hoc. And the danger in that, Mr. Speaker, is that we come back time and time again to correct the ad hoc mistakes or to add a little bit more in. And it becomes a system that's very difficult to understand. And when we did the last bill, Mr. Speaker, in Select Committee, our expert advisor made this very point, that the piecemeal changes that the government keeps making are confusing for the sector that uses them, the tax accountants that use them, let alone, Mr. Speaker, the individual taxpayers, the people for whom the IRD actually mainly work with and for. They're confused because there is no coherent framework. So we stand here once again with a bill that is, as described sometimes by the IRD, is about making sure that the original intent of tax legislation can be clarified. Well, that's a problem. If we're spending all our time doing that, let's go back and work out what should be in this legislation. But again, Mr. Speaker, it's not. We have a set of ad hoc, remedial, piecemeal measures that are frankly mostly useful as far as we can tell, but they don't constitute an overall picture of where taxation should be going in New Zealand. The one thing we do know for sure is that this bill will set the annual rates for taxation for 2016-2017. Now again, here would have been an opportunity for the government to say, it's time for some fairness. It's time to have another look and make sure that we've got the rates set in a way that's fair, not just automatically roll them over, because prior to the budget, Mr. Speaker, we heard a lot from the government about their concerns about what's known as bracket creep or fiscal drag or whatever you want to call it, the idea that some people are being, quote, captured by the fact that their incomes have risen but the tax brackets have changed. So I thought when this bill came out, Mr. Speaker, I thought, well, there you go, the government will be true to its word. They will have addressed that issue. They are the ones who raised it in the run-up to the budget. Nothing. Nothing? Not a word. Not a single word. So it's crocodile tears, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the people who might over time have seen the fact that their incomes had increased but the tax rates hadn't changed. Not a word in here. The annual rates have been set for 2016-17 and they go on regardless. So the public of New Zealand might want to reflect on the real commitment of the National Party in addressing that. It's all very well to wave around the idea of tax cuts, say that they're going to come in the never, never, rely on outrageous forecasts in the budget, and then the Prime Minister, and then Bill English stands up and says, no, there's no room for tax cuts. He puts on his best doer-dipped-in face and he says there's no room for tax cuts. And then John Key comes along, floating from one cloud to cloud, as Mr. English once said, and says, oh no, we can do them, $3.5 billion. I reckon, that was the phrase, that'll go down in history when he was asked how much would be required for tax cuts, about $3 billion, I reckon. That's how they're making tax policy nowadays in the National Party, on John Key's reckonings. Well, we can do a whole lot better than that, Mr. Speaker. This would have been the opportunity for the government to have done that when they set the annual rates for 2016-17, and they completely failed to address any of those issues. What else the bill does, Mr. Speaker, is a range of measures. The one that I want to focus a bit of time on today is the changes that have been made around look-through companies. Now, the whole issue of the place and role of look-through companies in our tax legislation has been in the spotlight in recent times. They popped up during the Panama Papers in one of the more unfortunate references to New Zealand, which was the desire of Mossack Fonseca to sell what they were calling combo packs to interested investors. So here we were as the McDonald's of tax havens, deciding, Mossack Fonseca deciding you could get a decent combo pack. It wasn't fries that came with your foreign trust, Mr. Speaker, it was a look-through company. And that was exactly what was being put on the table, was that for particular types of investment, you could find yourself the look-through company vehicle. And the example that was given was of in the Panama Papers was of a French investor rather, who had previously had his money in a Swiss arrangement, who changed that to a New Zealand look-through company arrangement on the basis that that could be zero rated for tax purposes if all of the income was foreign income. The New Zealand look-through company could be zero rated for tax purposes. And then when the person repatriated their income back into France, they were able to say that they'd paid tax. Now, they'd paid tax at a rate of zero, so they hadn't, but they actually were able to tell the French authorities that they had paid tax at that rate. That's what our look-through companies are being used for today. That's what's in the Panama Papers. So when we come to discuss the changes on look-through companies that are proposed in this legislation, members on this side of the House will be looking very closely to see what we are doing. I think on my first reading, I'll give this to the IRD officials, they are tightening up a little around how look-through companies are being used. Well, I trust them, Mr. Bishop, to do that. I'm not so sure about the government members, but I think the officials who've brought this bill to the House are actually looking to try and tighten up around how look-through companies are run. My colleague Stuart Nash, when he was speaking in the House last night, was running through the ways in which there was an effectively free untaxed capital gain that was being realised by New Zealand owners of look-through companies. That is certainly an issue to look at. We also want to look at the treatment and use of look-through companies by foreign investors and those who hold foreign trusts, because clearly from our point of view that misuse of a look-through company is significantly damaging for New Zealand. And it needs to be noted again in the context of my earlier remarks about the piecemeal nature of these kinds of tax bills, is that it was a 2010 piece of legislation put through by this government that actually enabled the arrangements for look-through companies as we see them today, and the exploitation of them by those with foreign trusts and seeking to shelter income from offshore. And it was Chapman Tripp who, in writing about the changes that were made, noted that New Zealand funds were now an attractive alternative to funds resident in Luxembourg, Ireland or the Caymans.
Oh my.
So that's the league that the 2010 changes put us into, and quite clearly have now been used, and we've seen the enormous explosion of foreign trusts as part of the aforementioned combo packs that are being sold around the world. So, Mr. Speaker, it is on those issues, the look-through company issues, that we will be focusing most of our attention. The remaining remedial matters, including issues to do with non-resident withholding tax, appear to us to be sensible and are in part our response to the government's work in relation to the base erosion and profit shifting work being done at the OECD. Again, a failure to come to this House with a comprehensive package to deal with that. And we heard today from the Minister of Revenue at Select Committee that his point of view is New Zealand can't really do much. We're just going to have to wait and see what the OECD comes up with. Doesn't think we need a diverted profits tax in New Zealand like his comrades in Australia and the UK have put in place. Just prepared to do a few little tiny piecemeal acts in this area. We should be a lot more ambitious than that, Mr. Speaker. The Labour Party will support this bill, but it is an ad hoc piecemeal response to a series of issues that require a strategic and coherent plan, sadly lacking from this government.
Well said. Mr. Speaker.
Christopher